A little while back, we did a series on our favourite supercars of each decade, and then we did another one on hot hatches, and it turned out you lot quite liked it. So why not go a little bit more controversial? It's time to pick the best cars from every single decade. Now, no doubt some of you are going to get angry and probably question the legitimacy of my parenthood, but sod it. We've got opinions, and you're going to like them. Speaking of controversial, to put the car that Enzo Ferrari described as the most beautiful of all time on this list is hardly going to cause hell to freeze over and Satan to rise up. The E-type followed the C-type and the D-type because Jaguar are very good at naming cars. But the C-type had brought us disc brakes, and the D-type had created ways of making much lighter cars, and Jaguar really needed a way of translating that from the track to the road that was better than the rather aging XK Coupe. When it arrived, the E-type was the fastest car in the world, and it could easily outshine anything created by Aston Martin or Ferrari, and it was cheaper than both of them. And that would explain why they built 72,000 E-types by the time it finished. Just to let you know, they only built 1,400 DB4s. And yes, the E-type lived for a lot longer, but the point still stands. Over the 13 years that followed, 85% of E-types ever made went off abroad, which really is a showcase of the enduring appeal of the E-type, as well as the fact that today, pretty much every single one of the E-types that was built and sold in the UK still exists. What's better than seeing a Fiat 500 when you're off on your holidays? Seeing a Renault 4, obviously. It's so good that Renault are bringing it back. And if you think that the 13 years the E-type was on sale for was a long time, nah. They kept making the original Renault 4 for 30 years. It was Renault's answer to the 2CV, except they wanted to create a car in the post-war world that wasn't still rooted in the 1930s. It did share a lot of the ideas the 2CV had, say, the long travel suspension, the really soft ride, the fact that it basically had some deck chairs inside rather than normal seats. But it also had some modern features like a really good 4-cylinder engine with a proper cooling system, torsion bar suspension, or the ability to actually hit motorway speeds. And it had a hatchback and loads of room, and it just looks cool from every single angle. Is there anything in the world you would rather cruise through the French countryside in than a Renault 4? Apparently, everyone agreed. 72,000 E-types? That's nothing. 8 million Renault 4s were built by the time they stopped making them in 1994. 1994! Yes, the Renault 4 is the third highest selling road car of all time, behind the Beetle and the Model T. And, just for a little treat, a Renault 4 once finished the Dakar Rally. The Black & Decker Workmate is a slightly strange place to start when we're talking about cars from the 1960s, but it is relevant. You see, the same person that designed that utilitarian piece of lightweight workstation that's in every single one of your dad's garages also designed the Lotus Elan. Yeah, there are some similarities, I guess. They're both lightweight, they're both made of metal. The Elan actually started its day as the predecessor, the Lotus Elite, but that had been made pretty much entirely of incredibly fragile glass fibre, which is the perfect material for building cars. For the Elan, Lotus decided that maybe that wasn't entirely true, and they replaced the rigid backbone with steel. Onto that, they strapped the transmission and the suspension, and then on top of that they could put a glass fibre body, just like the predecessor. They liked that system of making cars so much that Lotus continued to use it for the next 3 decades. Up front, they put a version of Ford's Kent engine that had been modified to twin cam spec and produced 100 horsepower, which might not sound a lot, but the Lotus Elan weighed 680 kilograms, so 100 is more than enough. And Ford liked it so much that they bought the design back from Lotus to stick in the Cortina. It had independent suspension all around and proper rack and pinion steering, so when you get it going, the Lotus Elan is possibly one of the purest sports cars to drive of all time. Now, rumour has it that the only thing that Gordon Murray was ever disappointed in his McLaren F1 was the fact that the steering just didn't feel like his Lotus Elan. Small, lightweight, nimble, ready to tackle the roads of Europe. These are all words that have never been associated with the Pontiac GTO. And yes, that's the GTO we're picking, because to be honest, it would be really boring to include the 250 in a list of the best cars from the 1960s, wouldn't it? Also, if we're going to include something American into this list, surely it should be the Mustang, right? Wrong. When the Mustang was created, its innards were already pretty dated. The Pontiac GTO is where you really want to be. It was the brainchild of Mr. John DeLorean. And if you think you've heard of that name before, yeah, you're correct. Before he created terrible supercars, John DeLorean worked for GM. GM at the time had a company-wide ban on creating cars for competition. But DeLorean and a couple of his colleagues looked away, looked at drag strips and thought, what if we created some cars for that? Presumably on your own, because if another car turned up, that would be competition. Actually, when you ordered your brand new Pontiac GTO, you didn't order a Pontiac GTO. You ordered a Pontiac Le Mans and spec'd the GTO kit. Then they would add Pontiac's 6.4 litre V8 into the bonnet, which was normally found in their much larger cars. It also had independent suspension, a 4-speed manual gearbox, and a limited slip differential. But actually, the main reason that we're allowing it onto this list is the sheer brazen nature of the fact that John DeLorean picked the GTO name because of the Ferrari. There is a man who works in the GR&R offices who still calls the Porsche 911 a Beetle coupe. But after 6 decades of development, that's more a reflection on him than on the 911. Yes, it is true that the 911 was very much a development of the 356, which itself was based on a Beetle. But by the time it was revealed at the Geneva Motor Show, the 911 was very much its own thing. The 901, as it was called then, was bigger than the 356. It was a 2+2 and it had a 2-litre engine that was air-cooled, a point that would become a bone of contention a few decades later for Porsche enthusiasts. And that 901 badge? Well, 82 cars were nailed together with the numbers 901 on the back before Peugeot came along and had something to say about it. See, at the time, Peugeot claimed that they were the only ones at the time who had the right to build cars with 3 numbers on the back with a 0 in the middle. And then Porsche was quite a lot smaller a company than Peugeot, so Peugeot won. At that point, the 911 was born and variants started popping up left and right like Targa and Turbo and all sorts of things. Such is the enduring appeal and love for Porsche's 911 that now more than 1 million have been built and sold. And boy, does our friend in the GR&R office hate that. The 60s was just the best decade if you just liked small coupes. Renault, Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Ferrari, they all made them. But Lancia took theirs off-road for rallying, so suck it, Alfa Romeo, you should have gone off-road. But Lancia didn't stick a flat 6 or a V8 in the bonnet of the Fulvia. They gave it a V4, an engine you're normally more likely to see on a motorbike. But Lancia had been consistently developing its V4 since the Lambda, one of its very first cars, so they weren't going to change then. But even then, to call it a V is a bit of a stretch. It wasn't a 120-degree V, it wasn't a 60-degree V. It was 13 degrees. Can't even call it a V, it's basically inline, but that meant that it could use a single cylinder head. Front-wheel drive also doesn't really suggest that it's going to be particularly fun, but with a shortened chassis over the saloon and better, more nimble suspension, this really was an extremely fun car to drive, and it was the car that Lancia decided to use to return to motorsport for the first time since the 1950s. The Lancia Fulvia HF won the Italian Rally Championship in 1966, 1967, 68, 69, 71, 72 and 73, and also was the car that won the predecessor to the World Rally Championship. And Lancia's Stratos would never have won the WRC without the Fulvia. The car wasn't developed in time, so they rallied Fulvias for the first few rounds, and the points that were collected for that meant the car won the championship. We couldn't really finish this list without mentioning the original supercar, could we? And yes, There were many cars that went before it that were super cars, but this was the very first proper mid-engined fast car for people to really just drool over. Also, there could be a debate with the E-type as to which one is actually the most beautiful car of all time, but given the Ferrari-Lamborghini relationship, Enzo was never going to say it about the Miura, was he? It wasn't the first mid-engined rear-wheel drive sports car. That honour goes to the Matra Jet, spelled with a D, obviously. But the Jet only actually had a 1.1 litre engine, so the Miura takes this crown. What they did when they created the Miura was give that beautiful body a transversely mounted 3.9 litre V12 with 350 horsepower. That was then wrapped in that stunning body, and I mean, just look at it, that had been designed by Gandini. It was so pretty that the original prototype, called P400, nearly caused a stampede when it was revealed at the Geneva Motor Show. The actual car would eventually be given the name of a famous breeder of fighting bulls in Spain. Why? Well, simply because when Lamborghini stopped making tractors and started making cars in 1963, they decided to put a bull on their badge. And that was that. It was then bought by some of the most famous people in the entire world, although they only ever made 760 of them between 1966 and 1974, so good luck getting your hands on one. And those are our favourite cars of the 1960s, possibly the first decade where motoring really starts to take off as commonplace. But you definitely don't agree with us on everything. We're not even included any Ferraris. So get in the comments and let us know what you think. And whether you like this video or not, if you watched it, pop us a like. And then subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon and make sure you see everything we do at Goodwood Road and Racing.